Alright, in this video, we're going to go ahead and get a development version of IIS set up on our computer, our development machine. We're going to go ahead and hook in some SSL certificates and ensure that all of our requests are made over SSL, so that we are properly testing everything with in a secure manner, so that when we go and deploy, we won't have any surprises. So like I said before, in the overview video, we're going to have this virtual machine, this virtual environment, which will kind of be our production quote-unquote environment. It's going to handle the continuous integration server, and it's going to handle the main master website, the actual website that your clients would go to, as well as the production database, as well as Photon. That'll all be inside of this one VM, and this VM is kind of like a representation of a real production server environment where you might deploy your application to in a real project. Alternatively, we can go ahead and restart this because I won't be needing this for a few minutes anyway. Alternatively, in the environment that you might be in, you might want to set up a box on your local network that's shared by all the developers in your team that has all of these responsibilities if you don't yet either have the resources or you don't yet have a VPN or a VPS or dedicated box on the internet that you could put your stuff onto. Now, obviously, when you go to publish your game, or even when you go to provide testing for your game for your customers doing beta or alpha testing, you'll need to have a real production server environment to stuff those responsibilities onto. But during development, you could always just pull a random box out of whatever and use that as your CI server and your staging environment, so that your team can work on your project and test. So that's what we're going to kind of be simulating with this virtual machine. This virtual machine is going to be our entire production environment for our game, which we do need to get configured at some point in order to take advantage of our auto updater, as well as to let all you guys play the game. I don't know how I'm going to do this quite yet, but I will be setting everything up on video using this virtual machine, because this virtual machine has nothing on it, and we'll be able to see all of the configuration steps from a completely blank system, which is good. But I will probably off video reconfigure the production environment to use one of 3D Buzz's servers, so that when it comes time to do public testing with you guys, we can hit those instead. So I just want to point out that we will be doing all the steps that I will be performing on this virtual machine. You can do on a machine of your own to get a production environment set up, even if we won't be using this virtual machine to do our main testing with when we make this game live or semi-live. However, we do need to still have our development environment. The reason I'm sitting here talking about a VM is because I want to make a very clear distinction between anything I do in this virtual machine and anything I do on my main computer. If I do it on my main computer, that is the development environment. That is an environment that you will be required to set up on every computer that you want to do development on this project on. Whereas if I do something in the virtual machine, that is going to be considered to be either the staging environment or the production environment. So I want to make that distinction very clear to you guys. We will be setting up IIS on this virtual machine. IIS is the web server we will be using. I will also be setting up and configuring IIS on my development machine. However, the thing is that I already have IIS installed on my development machine. I mean, that's what I use for all of my local development, is my local instance of IIS. But since it's already installed on my development machine, I won't be able to show you guys all the steps required to get it going on your production or staging environment or your own development machine. So that's why I'm introducing this production box right now, or production quote-unquote box right now, so that I can show you guys the steps required for installing IIS. It's really straightforward, but I do want to walk you guys through it, so that you can replicate these steps on any machine that you want to do development on, as well as any machine that you want to deploy this application to, or at least the web application side of things too. So we'll get IIS set up on this machine, and what I'm hoping is that people who are following along are going to follow these steps on their development machine as well. Then we'll minimize the virtual machine and then get our website configured on our development machine to use my development version of IIS. Anyway, installing IIS, I'm making it sound really scary. It's really, really not. Jump into your start menu and jump into your programs and features, where you would typically go to uninstall applications. And then come over here to the left panel and you'll see turn Windows features on or off. And we'll click on that. And we'll wait a year because this is Windows. I do want to point out that this process will be slightly different if you're deploying to a server. If you're deploying to a server, instead of going to turn Windows features on and off, you would add a server role to your server. But that's all done with the wizard that comes up with the server management interface that is going to display on login by default. But if you're on Windows 8 or Windows 7, you'll have to jump into your Windows features, and we'll jump into Internet Information Services, and that's what IIS stands for. We'll want to install our web management tools. We'll definitely want to install our IIS management service, our IIS management console. We will not be installing IIS 6 management compatibility because IIS 6 is old and terrible. Then we'll want to jump into World Wide Web Services. We want to add .NET extensibility. We want to add ASP.NET. We want to make sure that ASAPI is enabled. Don't care about server-side includes. On common HTTP features, we definitely want to go ahead and add how about HTTP errors and HTTP redirection. On security, I think we can just go ahead and add basic authentication anyway. That's a very common thing to add. You could also add Windows authentication. I mean, honestly, you can pretty much add all of this stuff. I don't know why they make it so granular. Probably because they want you to... I don't even know. But on performance features, we definitely want dynamic content compression and static content compression. These will enable gzip for our requests, or at least give us the option of using gzip. And gzip is a very nice compression algorithm. It's very fast, and it's used pretty much all over the place to reduce the amount of bandwidth required to access your site. I think these are all the features we need. So let's go ahead and hit OK, and then Windows is going to install them. So again, IIS is a built-in feature to Windows. Of course, we have to explicitly enable it inside of our Windows features dialog, but it is built-in. It is, free. It comes with every version of Windows, and yeah. I think I'll go ahead and pause the video while Windows decides to do whatever it is it thinks it's doing right now, which probably isn't even what I'm asking it to do, but still, it's Windows. All right, now that we have IIS installed, we can go ahead and start using it. So in order to work with IIS and configure it, you're going to want to go ahead and launch your IIS manager, which is a nice little interface that allows you to configure all aspects of your web server. We'll be spending some time in IIS manager this video to get everything configured, as well as to get our SSL certificate working. But yeah, that's the IIS manager. So this is all on Windows 7, IIS 7. My development machine is Windows 8. So I'll go ahead and minimize out my VMware for my virtual machine, assuming that you guys have completed the installation on your own development machines. And if you were to open up IIS, you should see something like this. So a couple important things about IIS. IIS organizes things into websites. Websites have host names. Host names are going to be the domain that the website is going to listen on. So what we want to do is we want to set up a new website on our development machine using IIS so that we have a static URL to our development version of the site that we can type into any browser at any time and we can also use to install SSL, and we can use for our testing. IIS and Visual Studio integrate rather nicely, but it comes with a caveat. When you instead choose to host your application using a real IIS server instead of IIS Express, you will need to launch Visual Studio in administrator mode, or as an administrator. It's the one annoying thing that we'll have to deal with, but it's worth it. Having IIS, a full version of IIS, that's a complete mirror of our production environment, is very important for development. I would encourage people who do ASP.NET development to make sure that they're using, if at all possible, their own IIS server with the appropriate host names set up. So I mentioned IIS Express a couple of times, but I don't think I ever really defined what it is. When working with Visual Studio comes with 2 ASP.NET servers built into it, or not built into it, but accessible to it, that can be used for development. So if we open up our web project and go to the Web tab, you'll see that we have a couple options. We have Use Visual Studio Development Server, Use Local IIS Web Server, and then a checkbox that says Use IIS Express. Well, IIS Express is a component that comes along with Visual Studio, and it's a version of IIS. It uses mostly the same code base that provides a very similar experience to working with IIS, but unfortunately is a little bit annoying to configure and isn't a replication of our production environment as much as I would like it to be. I think either way you slice it, as far as teaching people things, as well as getting into the habit of working with a real version of IIS, as well as completely mirroring our production environment, I generally don't use IIS Express. It's not bad. It works. It works really well, and I'll use it for one-off applications and stuff like that. But for things that I have an investment in developing, it's going to be a long-term project, I will always use the normal straight-up IIS that I install on my computer. You might have noticed IIS Express actually comes with a tray icon whenever we use it, and we can right-click on it and see all of the sites it's currently running. And we can also hit View All Applications, which shows us all of our applications. Yeah, the problem is to get these applications to run on a custom host name, we would run into an issue, or 2 issues. First of all, we wouldn't be able to use IIS Express to listen on port 80, because IIS is going to be listening on port 80. In addition, we also have to deal with this nasty application host.config file that I hate. So again, in the interest of keeping things as close to production as possible, I really want to just use IIS normally. So I'm going to close out of this. What I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to close out Visual Studio completely. I'm going to make sure I save my solution. And then I'm going to launch it again, but I'm going to make sure to run it as an administrator. And that'll ensure that I can access IIS. You'll also note that you might be saying, oh, I don't really want to run this as administrator, that's annoying. Well, once we get into the actual development of the game, you'll have to run Visual Studio as an administrator anyway if you want to debug Photon. So it's really something you're going to have to do anyway. Like I said, it's a little annoying, but it works. I'm going to go ahead and launch my solution again. And let's go ahead and get this set up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my IIS manager. Let's go ahead and create a site. I'm going to create a site called MMO2.3dbuzz.dev. My MMO.3dbuzz.dev is for my own development. So for this series, we will use MMO2.3dbuzz.dev. And you might be looking at this URL and saying, I've never heard of a TLD called dev before. Well, it doesn't exist. What I do is I use a file called the hosts file on my computer that will allow me to insert arbitrary DNS entries, meaning I can make literally whatever URL I want to, whether it has a recognized TLD or not. And I use that to my advantage for creating these dev sites. And I always use the TLD of dev. or the imaginary TLD of dev. The reason I do that is because let's say, for example, I had this be dev.3dbuzz.com as opposed to 3dbuzz.dev. The problem with that is that my cookies would start to conflict between my development environment and my production environment. By having .dev at the end instead of a .com at the end, I make it so that the cookies won't conflict with the two services, which is exactly what I want. So let's go ahead and make a site. To make a site, I'm going to right-click Sites and say Add Website. The name, I'm going to call it mmo2.3dbuzz.com, or oops, dev. Now the physical path, this is important. The physical path is actually going to be the path to my project, my web project. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up in File Explorer so that I can remind myself where I even stuck this thing in the first place. And it's going to be in F. I'll smooth this off to the side as I navigate through my horribly organized hard drive. It's under there. It's under there. It's under there. Wow, this is deep. MMO class BuzzMMO source. Here we go. So this is our root project folder with, you can see our Git repository. This is our source folder underneath that contains our Visual Studio solution. And then this right here is our website. This is what we want to place as our physical path. See, IIS won't have any problem serving up a website even if that website came from a Visual Studio solution. So the folder structure that the Visual Studio solution uses is a folder structure that IIS understands, meaning we can basically overlap IIS straight onto our solution so that, well, things are easy and straightforward. So all you got to do is come down here, select that, and hit OK, and now that's the physical path to our website. Now we need to pass in a binding. So our site name is not actually the domain name that we use to access the site. It's just an arbitrary name that we have, and I typically like the site name to be the domain name of the site. It makes it easier to find. But what actually determines what you have to type into your browser to get to a particular site is going to be the host name. It's going to be the bindings. We're first going to create an HTTP binding to make things simple. Then we're going to add an HTTPS binding as well, and then we'll add code that'll force them to use the HTTPS version, not the HTTP version. Now my host name, this is going to be the domain. Again, this is going to be the domain name that we type into the browser to get to the site. It's going to be mmo2.3dbuzz.dev. And then I'm going to make sure Start Website Immediately is checked, and I'll hit OK. IIS is now hosting this website. This isn't really an IIS tutorial, so I'm not going to talk about application pools or classic versus integrated mode. If you're using IIS 7 right now, everything will be configured properly. So what would happen if I go to mmo2.3dbuzz.dev right now? Well, Chrome's not going to even let me do that. There we go. We'll get an error. Now the reason we get an error is because, like I said before, the TLD or the top level domain of dev doesn't exist. This is not a real DNS entry that's publicly accessible on the internet. It just so happens that I have a server on my local computer that will respond to requests that have mmo2.3dbuzz.dev in them. That doesn't mean that my browser knows how to get from this arbitrary domain name that I picked to that web server. So what we need to do is we need to instruct our local computer to treat all requests to mmo2.3dbuzz.dev to point to ourselves so that our IIS server can pick up on that request and serve out the page. To do that, it's going to require us editing our hosts file. Now the host file is a file, like I said, it's a file on the computer that you can use to override DNS entries, regardless of where those DNS entries came from. The easiest way to edit your hosts file is to go ahead and load up Notepad. Make sure you right-click on Notepad and you say Run as Administrator. That's really important because the host file is going to be protected in such a way that it will not allow us to edit it if Notepad is not running as an administrator. So next up, you're going to want to go to File, Open, and you'll get a Open dialog box. You're going to want to go to your C drive, Windows, Drivers, System32 drivers, System32, Drivers, etc, and your host file is right here. Well, it's not going to show it to us yet, though, because we are currently filtered for .txt files. So go down here to your txt files and say All Files, and now we see our host file right there. Go ahead and hit Open. Alright, so what you should see now is a file that looks like this. The format that we have is the IP address that the hostname will resolve to, followed by the hostname itself. So basically what it's saying is anytime this computer tries to make a request to localhost, it's going to resolve to the address of 127.0.0.1. Let's go ahead and add another entry in. Now, the computer that I want this address to resolve to is, of course, 127.0.0.1, but the host name is actually going to be mmo2.3dbuzz.dev, meaning I'm overriding my DNS on my local computer so that my development site, this address, will always point to my local server or my local computer, and because it points to my local computer, IIS will pick up on that request, given that the request was made on port 80. And if IIS sees that our host name is mmo2.3dbuzz.dev, it'll serve this site to our browser. So let's go ahead and make sure that we save this file. Come back here to our Chrome window and hit refresh and see what happens. We have a site. So let's go ahead and log in. Wait a year and a half, and everything is working. So we can now access our development site simply by going to mmo2.3dbuzz.dev, and we can also guarantee that this is going to be the domain or the host name for this particular site, whether we're working with our launcher or working with our deployment setup or anything like that. Of course, this is a development site. Basically, every person who would be working on this project would have their own development site, and their mmo.3dbuzz.dev would be different from yours because they would all be pointing to their local machines. But that's okay. The point is now we have this, and it's always going to be running. I want to point out another potential issue that you might run across. I'm not sure, actually, if IIS is smart enough to handle this case, but I know Apache isn't. If you're running Skype on your computer, you might have to close out Skype or restart your computer after you install IIS. I forgot to mention that before. If you're having an issue with your port being in use already, port 80, it's probably because Skype for some reason decides to bind to port 80 if it doesn't get to first, or if IIS doesn't get to that binding first. I probably should have mentioned that like 15 minutes ago. But anyway, we have a site now. And that's really cool. So again, this is our development site. This isn't our production environment, but that's good enough for now. Let's go ahead and get our SSL certificate created. So we'll definitely want to perform all of our development, or do all of our development using as much of a replication of our production environment as possible, and that's also going to include using SSL for our security, or for our encryption, and for the validation of our identity. However, SSL certificates cost money. So what we're going to do is we are going to generate a self-signed certificate for testing purposes, and then we're going to take that self-signed certificate and install it on our computer so that it is considered to be a valid certificate. But before we do that, we should probably take a look at one last issue with our setup in Visual Studio. I just want to get this out of the way really fast. We did set up everything with IIS correctly, but Visual Studio still thinks, or at least our CS proj is still telling Visual Studio to think, that we are wanting to use IIS Express. So to change this behavior, because basically, so what would happen is if I hit Control F5 or F5 to go into debug mode, Visual Studio will launch an IIS Express server that'll be hosting the same application as the IIS server we just configured. Obviously, that's not desirable. We want to be able to have Control F5 launch the appropriate hostname or the appropriate address on our default browser, but we'll also want to be able to hit F5 to debug our application through IIS. To do that, we'll make sure use local IIS web server is checked. We'll uncheck use IIS Express, and then we'll pass in the project URL of mmo2.3dbuzz.dev, and we'll hit save. If you did not get an error, that means that this was a virtual directory that did exist and everything is good. I want to point out one last thing while we're on this dialogue. I never pointed out this use Visual Studio Development Server thing. Yeah, don't ever check this ever. Never, ever use the Visual Studio Development Server. It's very much out of date, and that is not the recommended development server to use with ASP.NET. The amount of differences between the Visual Studio Development Server and IIS itself is just amazing, and you will very likely run into compatibility issues between the two when you actually go and try to deploy the site to a real server as opposed to a development server. So yeah, you don't want to use that. Okay, so now that we've set everything up with our project, that's all I really want to do in Visual Studio in this video. We'll want to go ahead and create our certificate as well as install it in our computer so that we don't get any nasty errors. To do this, we need to install a resource pack. Basically, there is a way within IIS to create a self-signed certificate. We can go to our root in our connections tab on our service manager. We can jump into server certificates, and we can hit this button, create self-signed certificate. But it has problems. The self-signed certificate that we generate using this feature of IIS 7 will not allow us to install it on our computer and have it appropriately validate against our website. What do I mean by that? Well, even if we generated a self-signed certificate and installed it on our computer, we would still get an SSL warning when going to this website through SSL. The reason being is that self-signed certificate, although the certificate itself is trusted, it won't have the common name that indicates it's supposed to work for this particular domain. So we need another way to create our self-signed certificate so that we can give it a name of the domain that we're going to be using it on, and then install that certificate on our computer so we don't get any errors or warnings. So to do that, we're going to have to download this. The IIS 6 Resource Kit Tools. IIS 6 comes with a tool called Self-Cert that allows us to go ahead and create a self-signed certificate with whatever common name that we want. Unfortunately, that's not true for doing this through the IIS 7 console. Okay, so let's go ahead and hit download. And go ahead and install this guy. And wait a year and a half. All right, hit next. Agree to this ridiculously long EULA. It really wants a company name, doesn't it? Buzz. Always choose custom. I don't know what it would do if I don't do that. Honestly, I don't want any of this stuff on my computer except for self SSL. So that's the only thing that I want to install. So I'll hit next, and I'll hit next, and then I'll hit finish. All right, so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to, let's see, let's just make this easy. Let's just jump directly into the folder that it installed to. I believe it's going to install under program files x86, IIS resources, there we go. So this is the folder it installed under. C program files x86. Of course, I have a 64-bit operating system. If you are running a 32-bit operating system, it'll just be C program files. IIS resources, and then self SSL. I'm going to go ahead and open up a command prompt window to this folder, and I'm going to generate a self-signed certificate. So I'll say self SSL, and then I'll say /n colon, capital N colon, CN stands for common name, which is going to be the domain name of where we want this or where we want to use this certificate, which is going to be mmo2.3dbuzz.dev /v:1000. Hit enter, and it says, do you want to replace the SSL settings for site 1? I don't know what that means, so I'll hit no. Did it do anything? Maybe I wanted to hit yes. Let's see. Yeah, I just overlooked one tiny little step, and that tiny little step is that I need to be in an elevated command prompt. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll go to File, Open Command Prompt, Open as Administrator. Of course, you can accomplish, if you're not on Windows 8, you can accomplish the same thing by opening up a command prompt as administrator and CDing into this directory. So let's try that again. I'm going to do self SSL /N CN equals mmo2.3dbuzz.dev /v:1000. Now it's going to say, do you want to replace the SSL settings for site 1? And I'm going to hit yes. Basically what's going on here is that the self SSL is a little bit confused about things. So just hit yes to that prompt. And you also might get an error saying error operating metabase. That's all fine too. It doesn't matter. What matters is that we now have a self-signed certificate that has the appropriate common name. And we can check that by coming into our server certificates in our IIS manager and hitting refresh and seeing that we now have this. So, yeah, that is now our self-signed certificate for mmo2.3dbuzz.dev, and it is indeed issued to the appropriate domain. So let's go ahead and get that set up. Let's open up sites. Let's open up mmo2.3dbuzz.dev. I'm going to right-click and hit Edit Bindings. And I'm going to add a new binding for SSL. So the type is going to be HTTPS. I'm going to do all unsigned on IP addresses. The port, of course, is going to be 443. The host name is going to be the same thing, mmo2.3dbuzz.dev. And then for my SSL certificate, I'm going to select mmo2.3dbuzz.dev. And then I'm going to hit OK. At least one other site is using the same yeah. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to override the other one. You might run into issues if you have multiple sites that use SSL on the same or bound to the same IP addresses. I could sit here and fiddle around with which IP addresses that I want to bind particular things to or which ports I want to bind particular things to, but I'm not going to worry about it right now. Instead, I'm just going to hook this SSL certificate up to this one site. And that's just the limitation of how SSL works. Now, coming back here to our site, we should now, it should still work on HTTP just like before, like what we see right now, or what we'll eventually see right now once IIS gets its act together. There we go. But we can also now do HTTPS : but we'll see an error. We'll see this site security certificate is not trusted. That's because we haven't installed the certificate on our computer. See, typically when you purchase a certificate, you're purchasing it from one of the few major certificate authorities. All computers, or most computers anyway, and most mobile devices come pre-installed with the SSL certificates of those root authorities. And then there's a chain of command, I guess you could say, where certificates issued by those certificate authorities are automatically trusted because their certificate authority certificate has been installed on your computer. In this particular case, we have a self-signed certificate, which means that it does not derive from a certificate authority, meaning it won't be trusted on our computer unless we tell it to be trusted on our computer. So to do that, let's jump back into our main thing on our IIS manager and jump into our server certificates. Let's right-click on our MMO2.3dbuzz.dev, or how about double-click on it, and we'll get our certificate. So it says, this CA root certificate is not trusted. To enable trust, install the certificate in the trusted root certification authority store. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and open up our run prompt. You can open up run prompt by just typing in Windows R. Alternatively, you should be able to get through this same command through the start menu, though I can't remember. And we're going to open up our MMC, our Microsoft Management Console. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to File, Add and Remove Snap-in. And we're going to scroll all the way down to our certificates, which wasn't actually that far down. And we're going to add it. Now, the Snap-in will always manage certificates for, and we want to go ahead and select, how about just my user account? I think that's where it'll show up at. Then hit OK, and we now have the Snap-in. Let's go into our personal certificates, and what we should see somewhere in our personal certificates, do not trust Fiddler root, that's funny. We should see, where are you? MMO2.3dbuzz.com. Alright, it must have been installed into our, let's go ahead and add and remove Snap-in. It must have been installed onto the computer itself. Derp. Let's do computer account. Let's do local computer and hit finish. So I'm going to remove my current user Snap-in and keep my local computer one. Open up my personal certificates, and there it is. So there's our MMO2.3dbuzz.com. Let's go ahead and copy it. Then let's jump into our trusted root certification authorities and jump into certificates. So these are basically the installed certificates by default for all the major root CAs. Then let's just right-click anywhere here and hit paste. And we have now added trust to our self-signed certificate. Now that we've done that, I can go ahead and hit close. And save console settings? No, I don't care. And hit OK. Let's jump back here and hit refresh. And we still might see an error that it's not trusted. I believe there's some sort of cache involved with Chrome. Let's try a different browser. I may need to restart my computer. Firefox doesn't wanna. Let's see about Internet Explorer. Yeah, Internet Explorer lets me in. It must have refreshed itself, whereas my other browsers did not. So if I were to go ahead and restart my computer, we would be able to view this as a trusted certificate, or as a trusted website for all of our browsers. Anyway, yeah, there was a whole lot of jumping around in this video, but I definitely did want to kind of contain as much as I could into this one video because we didn't do a whole lot of coding, because this stuff is important to ensure that we develop our application in an environment that's as close to production as possible, because otherwise we would run into nasty surprises every now and then and life would be miserable. So replicating our production environment on our local computer is incredibly important. To do that, we need to make sure we're using a production web server such as IIS. We need to make sure that we give our development site a host name that's unique and specific to our computer. And since we're going to be enforcing SSL on this site, we'll want to make sure that we have a self-signed certificate that we have trusted on our computer in order to test any of the security-related functionality that we might need. There are a lot of things when working with the website and working with APIs that won't quite mesh well with untrusted self-signed certificates. So that's kind of why I wanted to go through the process of making sure that we have a trusted self-signed certificate installed on our machine. But I think that pretty much wraps up this video, and we'll see you guys in the next one.